Every empire believes its money will outlive doubt. Every government speaks as if its promises are made of stone. And every age eventually discovers the same humiliation. They were not. History is full of people who still had money, and yet had already lost security. Coins in the hand, numbers in the bank, wages still arriving, but bread slipping out of reach, savings turning weightless, a lifetime of discipline collapsing into a lesson no one wanted to learn. Because money is not bedrock. It is organized trust. And when that trust begins to rot, society changes faster than most people can think. Prices change, power changes, fear changes. The people who feel safe one year can be exposed the next. That is the real question beneath every monetary collapse. Not just how money dies, but what remains when it does. Money was supposed to make society more stable. That was the bargain. It gave strangers a common language. It let grain, labor, rent, taxes, and debt flow through one shared measure. It allowed empires to govern at scale, merchants to trade at distance, and ordinary people to believe that tomorrow could be planned. But that is the paradox. When money breaks, it does not merely expose a weakness in currency. It exposes what a society truly trusts underneath it. Because the first thing that dies in a monetary collapse is not the paper, or the coin, or the number on a screen. It is the illusion of safety attached to them. A collapsing currency does not simply lose value. It strips away confidence. And once confidence goes, people do what they have always done. They retreat from promises toward whatever still feels real. Food, metal, land, foreign money, useful skill, personal networks. Anything that does not depend entirely on permission, policy, or hope. That is why collapse is not just a financial event. It is a migration of trust. And when trust moves, society moves with it. Prices move first, then power, then fear. The respectable saver, the salaried worker, the loyal citizen, the prudent family, all can discover very quickly that the system they relied on was not a foundation at all, but an arrangement held together by belief. That is what makes monetary history so unsettling. It forces a harder question than most people want to ask. Not whether money can fail, it can, but where trust goes when it does.
So if money can die, what does value run toward when it does? History gives a consistent answer. Not one refuge, but several. Again and again, when monetary order breaks, trust flees toward 5 things. First, tangible assets, land, metal, property, things with weight, scarcity, and presence. Second, essential goods, food, fuel, cloth, medicine, tools, the items people still need when confidence disappears. Third, productive capacity, the farm that still yields, the workshop that still repairs, the hands that can still build, move, or feed. Fourth, value outside direct system control. Foreign currency, hidden reserves, assets beyond the reach of banks, decrees, or desperate states. And fifth, new networks of acceptance. Because when official money weakens, people do not stop exchanging. They build smaller circles of trust instead. That is the framework of this video. We are not just looking at collapses, we are tracing the movement of belief.
Not where money was supposed to hold, but where trust actually went when it no longer did.
For centuries, the Byzantine solidus was one of the most trusted coins on earth. It was gold. It was consistent. It was recognized across borders that did not share language, law, or rulers. Merchants in distant markets accepted it because they believed its weight meant something. Its purity was not just a technical detail, it was a political promise made visible. That is what made it so powerful. The solidus did not merely help people buy and sell, it helped organize an entire world of trade. It connected ports, tax systems, military payments, merchant networks, and imperial credibility into one shared monetary order. When people trusted the coin, they were also trusting the empire behind it. And that is precisely what makes the story so tragic. The solidus did not die in one dramatic collapse. It was weakened slowly, quietly, administratively. Over time, imperial authorities began reducing the gold content, stretching the coin, protecting the state in the short term while corroding confidence in the long term. This is the old temptation of power. When rulers run short of real resources, they try to manufacture relief through money, not by creating wealth, but by diluting the measure that claims to represent it. At first, the system can survive that kind of dishonesty. The coin still circulates. People still use it. Trade does not stop overnight. But trust has changed. And once trust changes, society changes with it. Merchants become more cautious. Inspection becomes stricter. The coin no longer moves with the same ease. The empire is still standing, but its money has begun to speak with a weaker voice. That is the humiliation at the center of Byzantine decline. A state that had inherited one of history's strongest monetary traditions slowly damaged the very instrument that made its influence possible. Even a gold coin can die if power destroys the belief inside it.
Debasement is often described as if it were only a technical problem. Less gold, more alloy, a weaker coin. But that is too shallow. What really changed was not just the metal. It was the social meaning of the coin. A trusted currency works because people stop thinking about it. It moves easily. It settles payments. It lets trade happen across distance because both sides believe the measure is stable before the exchange even begins. Debasement breaks that silence. The moment merchants begin to suspect the purity, the coin is no longer neutral. It is no longer shared ground. It becomes a question, a risk, an argument. And that is where power enters the transaction. Because once the state weakens the coin, it is not merely reducing gold content. It is quietly shifting loss onto everyone who uses money for ordinary life. The empire gains temporary breathing room, but the market inherits uncertainty. Now every exchange carries friction. Inspection becomes stricter. Discounts appear. Old coins are hoarded. Better metal disappears from circulation, and trust begins to leave the official system. This is the deeper mechanism of monetary decline. Confidence does not vanish into thin air. It migrates away from the coin, toward real gold, toward land, toward private reserves, toward transactions outside imperial reach. That is how money changes society under pressure, not only by losing value, but by changing behavior. Trade becomes slower. Caution replaces ease. The state still commands obedience, but its money no longer commands belief. And once a currency becomes political in that way, it is already weaker than it looks. The Black Death did not only kill people, it changed the price of being alive. In the mid-14th century, plague tore through Europe with a scale of destruction that is still hard to comprehend. Villages emptied, fields went untilled, Workshops fell silent. Families vanished so quickly that property, tools, and land outlasted the people meant to use them. And that is where the story becomes economically unsettling. When so many people disappear, value does not stay where it was. It moves. Before the plague, labor was abundant. Landlords held leverage. Wages were low. The structure of society rested on the assumption that human work could be replaced. Then, half the workforce died. And in that moment, labor changed from something ordinary into something scarce. The surviving worker was no longer just another body in the field. He was a constraint on the entire system. A missing pair of hands could delay harvests, disrupt rents, weaken estates, and interrupt the flow of food into cities. That changed bargaining power. Workers could demand more. Tenants could negotiate. Families with silver, stored goods, or simply the strength to keep producing suddenly occupied a different position in society. Land that had once symbolized aristocratic permanence became easier to acquire, harder to manage, and less powerful without labor to sustain it. This is what makes the Black Death such a brutal monetary lesson. The crisis did not just destroy wealth. It rearranged value itself. Money still mattered, but under conditions of demographic collapse, survival, skill, mobility, and productive capacity mattered more. That is when history turns. Because the people left standing did not merely inherit a ruined world. Many of them inherited leverage.
And here is the first secret history forces us to confront. What survives after money dies is not always gold. Sometimes it is the ability to eat, to work, to repair, to grow, to keep other people alive when the system around them is failing. That is what the Black Death reveals so clearly. When demographic collapse tears through a society, value does not automatically gather around the richest object. It gathers around the scarcest useful capacity. A coin can still glitter. A title can still sound important. A piece of land can still look impressive on paper. But none of those things can harvest a field by themselves. None of them can mend a tool, move grain, or keep a town supplied. That is why crises are so merciless. They do not only destroy wealth, they expose which forms of value were passive and which were alive. And that is not just medieval history. Every serious crisis does this in some form. It reprices people, not equally, not fairly, but decisively. The person who can still produce, still adapt, still supply, still solve practical problems, that person becomes more valuable than the system used to admit. Which means collapse is not only about the failure of money, it is also about the revaluation of human usefulness. And that is a far more unsettling thought. Because it suggests that, when systems crack, society does not simply ask who has assets. It asks who still matters.
In the 14th century, Florence was not just a rich city, it was one of Europe's financial command centers. Its banking houses helped move money across kingdoms, finance trade, manage sovereign debts, and extend credit on a scale that made them seem almost untouchable. Names like Bardi and Peruzzi carried the aura of permanence. Their size suggested strength, their reach suggested safety. But finance has always had a cruel weakness. The larger the structure, the more people assume it cannot fall. And then, political power broke the chain. These Florentine banks had lent enormous sums to rulers, most famously Edward III of England. When those loans were not repaid, the damage did not remain contained inside elite contracts. It spread outward. That is the key point.
A banking collapse is never just a private failure between lender and borrower. It pulls an entire city into the consequences of broken trust. Credit tightens, trade slows, payments stall, confidence fractures, and suddenly, the citizen who thought his savings rested inside a respected institution discovers something far more unsettling. Reputation is not protection. That is the lesson Florence leaves behind. A bank can look powerful, connected, sophisticated, and essential to the functioning of society, and still be fatally exposed to the political failures above it. Size is not safety. Prestige is not security. And when the credit structure snaps, even a great commercial city can be dragged into disorder. That is why the Florentine collapse still feels modern. Because every age wants to believe that its biggest institutions are too central to fail. History keeps answering otherwise.
What Florence exposes is not just a medieval banking problem. It exposes a permanent illusion. The illusion is this: if an institution is large enough, connected enough, and important enough, then it must also be safe. But size has never guaranteed safety. In finance, it often does the opposite. It hides fragility behind complexity. It persuades depositors, merchants, and entire cities to confuse scale with strength. That is why the phrase "too big to fail" is so dangerous. It sounds like protection. In reality, it is often just collective dependency wearing the mask of stability. A bank does not hold your wealth in the simple way people imagine, not like a locked chest with your name on it. It intermediates, it lends, it transforms short-term confidence into long chains of obligation, which means your savings are never only your savings. They are also exposure to the quality of the institution, the borrowers behind it, and the political order above it. Most people do not feel that exposure in normal times. That is what makes banking so powerful. It turns systemic trust into everyday convenience. But when the intermediary breaks, the spell breaks with it. And that is the shock. People discover that what felt like stored security was, in part, a claim resting on other people's ability to pay, other institutions' ability to function, and the system's ability to keep belief alive. That realization is always late, and it is always brutal. Because once the chain snaps, the depositor is no longer asking whether the institution was prestigious, only whether the promise can still be honored. That is the deeper lesson. Your money in a bank is not just money. It is trust routed through a structure you do not control. And if that structure fails, what looked like safety can become exposure overnight. War does not only destroy cities, it destroys monetary restraint. During the American Civil War, both sides learned that modern war was too expensive for taxes and borrowing alone. So paper expanded. In the North, inflation strained daily life. In the South, the damage turned cruel. Confederate notes remained everywhere. Wages were paid, prices were posted. Families still held stacks of paper. But the currency was dying in plain sight. A soldier could be paid and still go hungry. A household could save notes and still lose security. The paper had not vanished. Its function had. That is the brutality of wartime inflation. Money does not need to disappear to fail. It only needs to lose enough trust that it can no longer command bread, fuel, cloth, or time. And once that happens, society hardens. Barter returns. Hoarding rises. Suppliers hold back. Payment no longer means protection. When paper money dies, society does not fall back into abstraction. It falls back into necessities: food, fuel, land, metal, access. Those are the things that begin to matter when currency can no longer carry trust. And that shift is never neutral. The person who saved carefully in paper is suddenly exposed. Years of discipline can be erased by inflation faster than they were built by work. Meanwhile, the person holding grain, livestock, tools, land, or tradable goods is no longer just secure. He is elevated. That is what monetary collapse really does. It does not simply make everyone poorer at the same speed. It redistributes power. The saver falls behind. The holder of hard goods gains leverage. The owner of supply can wait. The desperate buyer cannot. This is why inflation and currency collapse feel so morally violent. They punish caution and reward position. They do not ask who acted responsibly. They ask who holds what the market still obeys.
This is legal tender.
And once society begins to reorganize around access to real goods, the old promises lose their social authority. Money may still circulate, but hierarchy has already changed. That is the deeper injustice. Monetary breakdown is not only loss. The French Revolution promised to rebuild society. Instead, it helped destroy money faster than war often could. The assignats began as a political solution. They were tied, in theory, to confiscated church lands. On paper, that gave them substance. In reality, the state kept issuing more. And that is the lesson. A currency cannot be saved by noble language if its supply is destroying belief. Revolutionary ideals may stir crowds. They cannot force trust to survive dilution. At first, the paper still moved. Markets still opened. Wages were still paid. But confidence was thinning underneath the surface. Then the break became visible. Farmers stopped wanting paper. They wanted grain, metal, goods, anything more solid than promises from Paris. And once producers refuse paper, the monetary order is already dying. That is what made the assignat collapse so politically devastating. It was not just inflation. It was disillusion. The new regime had promised renewal, but in daily life, people saw shortage, rising prices, and paper losing authority by the week. When that happens, a revolution does not just lose purchasing power, it loses moral credibility. And here is the second secret. Money does not die the moment a government prints too much of it. It dies when society stops surrendering real goods in exchange for the promise printed on top. That is the deeper threshold. A currency can survive expansion for a time. It can survive strain. It can even survive visible abuse longer than people expect. As long as farmers still release grain, merchants still release stock, workers still accept wages, and households still believe tomorrow's paper will command tomorrow's life. But once that acceptance breaks, the story changes. At that point, this is no longer only a monetary problem. It becomes a problem of social order. Because money is not just issued by the state, it is ratified by society. Its real backing is not ink, design, or law alone. It is the continuing willingness of people to part with food, fuel, labor, shelter, and time. When that willingness disappears, the paper may remain, the regime may remain, the institutions may remain, but the money is already dying. That is the turning point history keeps revealing. Currencies do not finally collapse in the printing room. They collapse in the market, at the farm gate, in the workshop, at the household table, wherever someone looks at a promise and decides to keep the goods instead. That is when a money story
becomes a social order story. By 1997, the danger was no longer just coins or paper. It was debt. Across Asia, entire economies had grown under the belief that stable exchange rates, foreign capital, and rapid expansion could coexist indefinitely. Currencies still existed. Governments still functioned. Banks still opened their doors. And yet, the system was already more fragile than it looked. Because much of the debt had been taken on in dollars. That is the trap. A nation can keep its own currency, its own institutions, even its own political symbols, and still be financially cornered if its obligations are denominated in someone else's money. Once the peg breaks, the damage multiplies fast. The local currency falls, but the debt does not fall with it. It grows heavier. That is what made the Asian crisis so brutal. Companies, banks, and governments were not merely watching exchange values collapse. They were watching their repayment burden expand at the same time. So this was never just a story about volatility. It was a story about dependence. A country borrowing in foreign currency may look sovereign in calm years. In crisis, it discovers the limit of that sovereignty. And when enough institutions share that weakness, fear does not stay local. It spreads across borders, through balance sheets, into jobs, savings, and the daily life of millions.
Foreign currency debt is one of the cleanest traps in financial history. It looks manageable in calm years. The loans arrive, growth continues, the exchange rate appears stable, and governments, banks, and firms begin to believe they can carry obligations priced in someone else's money without losing control. But control was always thinner than it looked, because once the local currency weakens, the debt does not shrink with it. It expands in real weight. What used to be a manageable burden becomes a tightening collar. That is the cruelty of borrowing in foreign currency. The country may still have its own flag, its own central bank, its own institutions, its own money in circulation. But when repayment is owed in dollars, sovereignty starts to narrow exactly when crisis begins. And that is when trust moves. It leaves the weaker currency. It leaves the weaker banking system. It leaves the weaker balance sheet. It runs toward the dollar system, foreign reserves, offshore assets, and anything already positioned outside the reach of local collapse. So the real residue of the crisis is not independence. It is dependence made visible. That is why foreign currency debt is so dangerous. It does not merely magnify loss. It reveals who controls the terms of survival. Lebanon offered one of the clearest modern versions of monetary collapse. Not because the money vanished from sight, because access vanished first. That is what made it so chilling. People could still see balances on screens. Accounts still existed. The banking system still had buildings, counters, documents, procedures, all the visual signs of continuity. But the money had already changed meaning. A deposit is supposed to feel like stored safety. In Lebanon, it became a trapped claim. Citizens discovered that money can remain digitally present and still become socially dead. Visible but unusable, counted but unreachable. Yours in theory, but no longer yours in practice. That is the modern edge of financial collapse. You do not need wheelbarrows of cash or banknotes blowing through the street. You only need a system that stops converting balances into life. Once withdrawals are blocked, the account stops functioning as protection. It becomes an abstraction under institutional control. And that changes society fast. Trust leaves the bank.
Cash outside the system matters more. Foreign currency matters more. Gold, property, and personal networks matter more. The screen still glows. The account still exists. But the social power of the money is gone. That is why Lebanon feels so frighteningly modern. The deposit survived digitally. It died socially.
So if we pull these collapses together, a pattern becomes clear. When money dies, value does not disappear. It relocates, and it usually runs toward 5 places. First, essential goods: food, fuel, medicine, cloth, tools, the things people still need when trust fails. Second, scarce, tangible assets: land, metal, property, stored commodities, things with weight, limits, and presence. Third, productive capacity: the farm that still yields, the workshop that still repairs, the person who can still build, move, or feed. Fourth, value outside direct system control: foreign currency, private reserves, hidden liquidity, anything not fully trapped inside failing banks, decrees, or institutions. And fifth, mobility: the ability to move value across borders, across networks, or into new circles of trust before the old one closes. That is the framework. Not all crises look the same, but the direction of trust is often remarkably similar. It leaves promises, and it moves toward usefulness, scarcity, control, and escape. That is what history keeps showing. Money dies, but value survives by changing form.
It is tempting to think the modern world has outgrown these dangers, that digitization made money safer, cleaner, more advanced. In one sense, it did. But it did not make money less fragile. It made the promise more abstract. Today, most people do not hold wealth as metal in the hand or paper in a drawer. They hold balances, salaries, pensions, bond funds, property valuations, retirement accounts, claims layered on top of other claims, and all of them still rest on trust architecture. That is the part modern life hides so well. A bank balance feels concrete because the screen is clear. A pension feels real because the statement arrives on time. An asset price feels solid because the market keeps quoting it. But clarity is not the same as certainty. The system is faster now, more connected, more digitized, and that means trust can move faster too. So the old lesson has not disappeared. It has only changed form. Money still depends on belief. Access still depends on institutions. And protection still depends on whether the promise can be converted into life when pressure arrives. That is why these old collapses still matter. They are not relics from a primitive world. They are mirrors. Money is not bedrock. It never was. It is organized trust. A system of belief made practical enough to govern trade, wages, debt, savings, and daily life. That is what gives it power. And that is also what makes it fragile. Because when trust begins to leave, society does not wait for permission. It reaches for whatever already carries value without needing to be announced. Food does not need a speech. Land does not need a slogan. Useful skill does not need a decree. A tool, a harvest, a reserve of metal, a trusted network, a way out. These things do not become real because institutions declare them real. They matter because life still obeys them. That is the colder question history keeps forcing into view. Not who looks richest when the system is calm, but who is holding what other people will still need when the promise starts to die.
That is where monetary collapse becomes moral as well as financial, because it reveals the distance between appearance and substance, between official value and lived value, between what society says it trusts and what it runs to when fear arrives. Money dies. Need does not. And in the end, that is what history leaves behind.
History does not matter because it tells us what was lost. It matters because it shows us what survived. Across empires, revolutions, plagues, defaults, bank failures, and collapsing currencies, the pattern is never clean. But it is never random either. Promises fail. Trust moves. Society reorganizes. And what remains is rarely the thing that looked strongest in the calm. That is why these stories are worth studying. Not to admire ruins, not to romanticize collapse, but to see more clearly what money really is and what people reach for when its spell breaks. If this gave you a new way to think about money, trust, and survival across history, stay with the Money Archives. There is always more hidden in the past than the present wants to admit.